Shortwave radio is radio transmission using shortwave frequencies, generally 1.6 to 30 MHz, just above the medium wave AM broadcast band. Shortwave radio has an ability to enter a state of skywave or skip propagation, in which the radio waves are reflected or refracted back to Earth from the ionosphere, as opposed to being absorbed. This is a particularly important characteristic. It allows the transmitted signal to be reflected around the curve of the Earth, thus shortwave is not line of sight. This allows for very long-distance communications. Shortwave radio is used for broadcasting of voice and music to shortwave listeners over very large areas, sometimes entire continents or beyond. Additionally, it is used for two-way international communication by amateur radio enthusiasts for hobby, educational and emergency purposes. Frequency classifications. The widest popular definition of the shortwave frequency interval is the ITU Region 1 definition, and is the span 1.6 to 30 MHz, just above the medium wave band, which ends approximately at 1.6 MHz. There are also other definitions of the shortwave frequency interval: 1.71 to 30 MHz in ITU Region 2, 1.8 to 30 MHz, 2.3 to 30 MHz, 2.3 to 26.1 MHz. In Germany and perhaps Austria, the ITU Region 1 shortwave frequency interval can be subdivided in der Grenzwelle 1.605 to 3.8 MHz and der Kurzwelle 3.8 to 30 MHz. Grenzwelle 1.605 to 4 MHz and Kurzwelle 4 to 30 MHz. In Germany, these shortwave frequency intervals have also been seen used 3 to 30 MHz, e.g. Some accept that high frequency is the same as shortwave. In reality, the definition of the shortwave frequency band is a mess, and therefore the shortwave frequencies cannot be exactly equal high frequencies. The above other definitions. Shortwave radio received its name because the wavelengths in this band are shorter than 200 meters, which marked the original upper limit to the medium frequency band first used for radio communications. The broadcast medium wave band now extends above the 200 meters, 1,500 kHz limit, and the amateur radio 1.8 MHz to 2.0 MHz band is the lowest frequency band considered to be shortwave. History. Development. Early radio telegraphy had used long-wave transmissions. The drawbacks to this system included a very limited spectrum available for long-distance communication, and the very expensive transmitters, receivers and gigantic antennas that were required. It was also difficult to beam the radio wave directionally with long-wave, resulting in a major loss of power over long distances. Prior to the 1920s, the shortwave frequencies above 2 MHz were regarded as useless for long-distance communication and were designated in many countries for amateur use. Guglielmo Marconi, pioneer of radio, commissioned his assistant Charles Samuel Franklin to carry out a large-scale study into the transmission characteristics of short wavelength waves, and to determine the suitability for long-distance transmissions. Franklin rigged up a large antenna at Poldhu Wireless Station, Cornwall, running on 25 kilowatts of power. In June and July 1923, wireless transmissions were completed during nights on 97 meters from Poldhu to Marconi's yacht Electra in the Cape Verde Islands. In September 1924, Marconi transmitted daytime and nighttime on 32 meters from Poldhu to his yacht in Beirut. Franklin went on to refine the directional transmission by inventing the curtain array aerial system. In July 1925, 1924, Marconi entered into contracts with the British General Post Office to install high-speed shortwave telegraphy circuits from London to Australia, India, South Africa and Canada as the main element of the Imperial wireless chain. The UK to Canada shortwave beam wireless service went into commercial operation on the 25th of October 1926. Beam wireless services from the UK to Australia, South Africa and India went into service in 1927. Shortwave communications began to grow rapidly in the 1920s, similar to the Internet in the late 20th century. By 1928, more than half of long-distance communications had moved from transoceanic cables and long-wave wireless services to shortwave, and the overall volume of transoceanic shortwave communications had vastly increased. Shortwave also ended the need for multi-million-dollar investments in new transoceanic telegraph cables and massive long-wave wireless stations. Although some existing transoceanic telegraph cables and commercial long-wave communications stations remained in use until the 1960s, the cable companies began to lose large sums of money in 1927, and a serious financial crisis threatened the viability of cable companies that were vital to strategic British interests. The British government convened the Imperial Wireless and Cable Conference in 1928 to examine the situation that had arisen as a result of the competition of beam wireless with the cable services. It recommended and received government approval for all overseas cable and wireless resources of the Empire to be merged into one system controlled by a newly formed company in 1929, Imperial and International Communications Limited. The name of the company was changed to Cable and Wireless Limited in 1934. Amateur use of shortwave propagation. Amateur radio operators also discovered that long-distance communication was possible on shortwave bands. Early long-distance services used surface wave propagation at very low frequencies which are attenuated along the path. Longer distances and higher frequencies using this method meant more signal attenuation. This, and the difficulties of generating and detecting high frequencies, made discovery of shortwave propagation difficult for commercial services. Radio amateurs may have conducted the first successful transatlantic tests in December 1921, operating in the 200-meter medium-wave band, the shortest wavelength then available to amateurs. In 1922, hundreds of North American amateurs were heard in Europe at 200 meters, and at least 20 North American amateurs heard amateur signals from Europe. The first two-way communications between North American and Hawaiian amateurs began in 1922 at 200 meters. Although operation on wavelengths shorter than 200 meters was technically illegal, amateurs began to experiment with those wavelengths using newly available vacuum tubes shortly after World War I. Extreme interference at the upper edge of the 150 to 200 meter band, the official wavelengths allocated to amateurs by the Second National Radio Conference in 1923, forced amateurs to shift to shorter and shorter wavelengths. However, amateurs were limited by regulation to wavelengths longer than 150 meters. A few fortunate amateurs who obtained special permission for experimental communications below 150 meters completed hundreds of long-distance two-way contacts on 100 meters in 1923, including the first transatlantic two-way contacts By 1924, many additional specially licensed amateurs were routinely making transoceanic contacts at distances of 6,000 miles and more. On the 21st of September, several amateurs in California completed two-way contacts with an amateur in New Zealand. On the 19th of October, amateurs in New Zealand and England completed a 90-minute two-way contact nearly halfway around the world. On October 10, the Third National Radio Conference made 3 shortwave bands available to U.S. amateurs at 80 meters, 40 meters and 20 meters. These were allocated worldwide, while the 10-meter band was created by the Washington International Radio Telegraph Conference on the 25th of November 1927. The 15-meter band was opened to amateurs in the United States on the 1st of May 1952. Propagation characteristics. Shortwave radio frequency energy is capable of reaching any location on the Earth as it is influenced by ionospheric reflection back to the Earth by the ionosphere. A typical phenomenon of shortwave propagation is the occurrence of a skip zone where reception fails. With a fixed working frequency, large changes in ionospheric conditions may create skip zones at night. As a result of the multi-layer structure of the ionosphere, propagation often simultaneously occurs on different paths, scattered by the E or F region and with different numbers of hops, a phenomenon that may be disturbed for certain techniques, particularly for lower frequencies of the shortwave band. Absorption of radio frequency energy in the lowest ionospheric layer, the D layer, may impose a serious limit. This is due to collisions of electrons with neutral molecules, absorbing some of a radio frequency's energy and converting it to heat. Predictions of skywave propagation depend on the distance from the transmitter to the target receiver. Time of day. During the day, frequencies higher than approximately 12 MHz can travel longer distances than lower ones. At night, this property is reversed. With lower frequencies, the dependence on the time of the day is mainly due to the lowest ionospheric layer, the D layer, forming only during the day when photons from the sun break up atoms into ions and free electrons. Season. During the winter months of the northern or southern hemispheres, the AM/MW broadcast band tends to be more favorable because of longer hours of darkness. Solar flares produce a large increase in D region ionization so high, sometimes for periods of several minutes. All skywave propagation is non-existent. Types of modulation. Several different types of modulation are used to impress information on a shortwave transmission. Amplitude modulation is the simplest type and the most commonly used for shortwave broadcasting. The instantaneous amplitude of the carrier is controlled by the amplitude of the signal. At the receiver, a simple detector recovers the desired modulation signal from the carrier. Single sideband transmission is a form of amplitude modulation but in effect filters the result of modulation. An amplitude-modulated signal has frequency components both above and below the carrier frequency. If one set of these components is eliminated as well as the residual carrier, only the remaining set is transmitted. This saves power in the transmission, as roughly 2/3 of the energy sent by an AM signal is unnecessary to recover the information contained on it. It also saves bandwidth, allowing about 1/2 the carrier frequency spacing to be used. The drawback is that the receiver is more complicated, since it must recreate the carrier to recover the signal. Small errors in the detector process can greatly affect the pitch of the received signal, so single sideband is not usual for music or general broadcast. Single sideband is used for long-range voice communications by ships and aircraft, citizens band, and amateur radio operators. LSB is generally used below 9 MHz and USB above 9 MHz. Vestigial sideband band transmits the carrier and one complete sideband, but filters out the redundant sideband. It is a compromise between AM and SSB, allowing simple receivers to be used but requiring almost as much transmitter power as AM. One advantage is that only half the bandwidth of an AM signal is used. It can be heard in the transmission of certain radio time signal stations. Continuous wave is on and off keying of a carrier, used only for Morse code communications. Narrowband frequency modulation is mainly used in the higher HF frequencies. Because of the larger bandwidth required, NB-FM is much more commonly used for VHF communication. Regulations limit the bandwidth of a signal transmitted in the HF bands, and the advantages of frequency modulation are greatest if the FM signal is allowed to have a wider bandwidth. NB-FM is limited to short-range SW transmissions due to the multiphasic distortions created by the ionosphere. Digital radio mondiale is a digital modulation for use on bands below 30 MHz. Radio teletype, fax, digital, slow scan television and other systems use forms of frequency shift keying or audio subcarriers on a shortwave carrier. These generally require special equipment to decode, such as software on a computer equipped with a sound card. Uses. Some major uses of the shortwave radio band are international broadcasting, primarily by government-sponsored propaganda, international news or cultural stations to foreign audiences. The most common use of all. Domestic broadcasting, to widely dispersed populations with few long-wave, medium-wave and FM stations serving them, or for specialty political, religious and alternative media networks, or of individual commercial and non-commercial paid broadcasts. Oceanic air traffic control uses the HF shortwave band for long-distance communication to aircraft over the oceans and poles, which are far beyond the range of traditional VHF frequencies. Modern systems also include satellite communications, such as at-sea, CPDLC, utility stations transmitting messages not intended for the general public, such as aircraft flying between continents, encrypted diplomatic messages, weather reporting, or ships at sea. Clandestine stations. These are stations that broadcast on behalf of various political movements, including rebel or insurrectionist forces, and are normally unauthorized by the government in charge of the country in question. Clandestine broadcasts may emanate from transmitters located in rebel-controlled territory or from outside the country entirely, using another country's transmission facilities. Clandestine stations were used during World War II to transmit news from the Allied point of view into Axis-controlled areas. Although the Nazis confiscated many radios and executed their owners, many people continued to listen. Numbers stations. These stations regularly appear and disappear all over the shortwave radio band but are unlicensed and untraceable. It is believed that numbers stations are operated by government agencies, and are used to communicate with clandestine operatives working within foreign countries. However, no definitive proof of such use has emerged, because the vast majority of these broadcasts contain nothing but the recitation of blocks of numbers, in various languages, with occasional bursts of music. They have become known colloquially as number stations. Perhaps the most noted number station is the Lincolnshire Poacher, named after the 18th-century English folk song, which is transmitted just before the sequences of numbers. Amateur radio operators at the 80, 75, 60, 40, 30, 20, 17, 15, 12, and 10 meter bands, time signal and radio clock stations in North America. WWV radio and WWVH radio transmit at these frequencies: 2,500 kHz, 5,000 kHz, 10,000 kHz, and 15,000 15,000 kHz, and WWV also transmits on 20,000 kHz. The TU radio station in Canada transmits on the following frequencies: 3,330 kHz, 7,850 kHz, and 14,670 kHz. Other similar radio clock stations transmit on various shortwave and long-wave frequencies around the world. The shortwave transmissions are primarily intended for human reception, while the long-wave stations are generally used for automatic synchronization of watches and clocks. Over-the-horizon radar. From 1976 to 1989, the Soviet Union's Russian Woodpecker over-the-horizon radar system blotted out numerous shortwave broadcasts daily. The term deasing, in the context of listening to radio signals of any user of the shortwave band, is the activity of monitoring distant stations. In the context of amateur radio operators, the term deasing refers to the two-way communications with a distant station, using shortwave radio frequencies. The Asia-Pacific telecommunity estimates that there are approximately 600 million shortwave broadcast radio receivers in use in 2002. WWCR claims that there are 1.5 billion shortwave receivers worldwide. Shortwave broadcasting. See International Broadcasting for details on the history and practice of broadcasting to foreign audiences. See Shortwave relay station for the actual kinds of integrated technologies used to bring high-power signals to listeners. Frequency allocations. The World Radio Communication Conference, organized under the auspices of the International Telecommunication Union, allocates bands for various services in conferences every few years. The last WRC took place in 2007. At WRC 97 in 1997, the following bands were allocated for international broadcasting. AM shortwave broadcasting channels are allocated with a 5 kHz separation for traditional analog audio broadcasting. Although countries generally follow the table above, there may be small differences between countries or regions. For example, in the official band plan of the Netherlands, the 49 meters band starts at 5.95 MHz. The 41 meters band ends at 7.45 MHz. The 11 meters band starts at 25.67 MHz, and the 120, 90 and 60 meters bands are absent altogether. Additionally, international broadcasters sometimes operate outside the normal WRC allocated bands or use off-channel frequencies. This is done for practical reasons, or to attract attention in crowded bands. The new digital audio broadcasting format for shortwave DRM operates 10 kHz or 20 kHz channels. There are some ongoing discussions with respect to specific band allocation for DRM, as it mainly transmitted in 10 kHz format. The power used by shortwave transmitters ranges from less than 1 watt for some experimental and amateur radio transmissions to 500 kilowatts and higher for intercontinental broadcasters and over-the-horizon radar. Shortwave transmitting centers often use specialized antenna designs to concentrate radio energy at the target area. Advantages. Shortwave does possess a number of advantages over newer technologies, including the following: difficulty of censoring programming by authorities in restrictive countries. Unlike the relative ease in monitoring the Internet, government authorities face technical difficulties monitoring which stations are being listened to. For example, during the Russian coup against President Mikhail Gorbachev, when his access to communications was limited, Gorbachev was able to stay informed by means of the BBC World Service on shortwave. Low-cost shortwave radios are widely available in all but the most repressive countries in the world. Simple shortwave regenerative receivers can be easily built with a few parts. In many countries, ownership of shortwave receivers has been and continues to be widespread. Many newer shortwave receivers are portable and can be battery-operated, making them useful in difficult circumstances. Newer technology includes hand-cranked radios which provide power without batteries. Shortwave radios can be used in situations where internet or satellite communications service is temporarily or long-term unavailable. Shortwave radio travels much farther than broadcast FM. Shortwave broadcasts can be easily transmitted over a distance of several thousands of kilometers, including from one continent to another. Particularly in tropical regions, SW is somewhat less prone to interference from thunderstorms than medium-wave radio, and is able to cover a large geographic area with relatively low power. Therefore, in many of these countries it is widely used for domestic broadcasting. Very little infrastructure is required for long-distance two-way communications using shortwave radio. All one needs is a pair of transceivers, each with an antenna and a source of energy. This makes shortwave radio one of the most robust means of communications, which can be disrupted only by interference or bad ionospheric conditions. Modern digital transmission modes such as MFSK and Olivia are even more robust, allowing successful reception of signals well below the noise floor of a conventional receiver. Disadvantages. Shortwave radio's benefits are sometimes regarded as being outweighed by its drawbacks, including, in most Western countries, shortwave radio ownership is usually limited to true enthusiasts, since most new standard radios do not receive the shortwave band. Therefore, Western audiences are limited. In the developed world, shortwave reception is very difficult in urban areas because of excessive noise from switched-mode power adapters, fluorescent LED light sources, internet modems and routers, computers and many other sources of radio interference. Shortwave listening. Many hobbyists listen to shortwave broadcasters without operating their own transmitters. In some cases, the goal is to hear as many stations from as many countries as possible. Others listen to specialized shortwave utility, or UT, transmissions such as maritime, naval, aviation, or military signals. Others focus on intelligence signals from numbers stations which transmit strange broadcast usually for intelligence operations, or the two-way communications by amateur radio operators. Some shortwave listeners behave analogously to lurkers on the internet, in that they listen only and never make any attempt to send out their own signals. Other listeners participate in clubs, or actively send and receive QSL cards, or become involved with amateur radio and start transmitting on their own. Many listeners tune the shortwave bands for the programs of stations broadcasting to a general audience. Today, through the evolution of the internet, a hobbyist can listen to shortwave signals via remotely controlled shortwave receivers around the world, even without owning a shortwave radio. Many international broadcasters offer live streaming audio on the websites. Shortwave listeners, or SWLs, can obtain QSL cards from broadcasters, utility stations or amateur radio operators as trophies of the hobby. Some stations even give out special certificates, pennants, stickers and other tokens and promotional materials to shortwave listeners. Amateur radio. The practice of operating a shortwave radio transmitter for non-commercial two-way communications is known as amateur radio. Licenses are granted by authorized government agencies. Amateur radio operators have made many technical advancements in the field of radio, and make themselves available to transmit emergency communications when normal communications channels fail. Some amateurs practice operating off off the power grid so as to be prepared for power loss. Many amateur radio operators started out as shortwave listeners and actively encourage SWLs to become amateur radio operators. Utility stations. Utility stations are stations that do not intentionally broadcast to the general public. There are shortwave bands allocated to the use of merchant shipping, marine weather, and ship-to-shore stations, for aviation weather and air-to-ground communications, for military communications, for long-distance governmental purposes, and for other non-broadcast communications. Many radio hobbyists specialize in listening to UT broadcasts, which often originate from geographic locations without known shortwave broadcasters. Unusual signals. The shortwave bands are also used by unlicensed individuals who may want mostly short-range party line-like communications. Two examples of the use of HF for communication between fishing boats in many areas of the world, and the unlicensed use of the 11-meter band, which is effectively permitted in some areas of the world. Unlicensed operators, called pirates, can cause signal interference to licensed stations. Many third-world countries have shops selling HF transmitter radios to any customer without regard to license or operator knowledge. As of 2012, there were virtually no national or international efforts to control such pirate operations. The shortwave bands are also used for various experiments, some continuing for years. In 2011, signals traceable to China regularly sent powerful HF transmissions scanning wide ranges of HF frequencies, perhaps to determine the maximum usable frequency or other variables. Numbers stations of broadcasts on shortwave radio that are coded into groups of numbers. Their content is generally encrypted and the purpose remains a mystery.